to record. There we go. Just so that that's going. We had about, no, it's always a blast, and I'm glad to get the band back together. We had about 268 people registered as of this morning for it. So I think we hit, I don't know, Rob was, or Michael, 400-ish was probably the peaks.
I think so. Usually we see, I mean, it depends. It was like 40 to 60% of the folks that would register. Maybe you get, and people would listen afterwards too. So I don't know, 100, 150 people today would be great based on what you said. So
yeah. And we'll see.
We're pretty in range with what we saw on average.
Yeah. Folks are starting to show up. We're about 47. Michael will also try, well, between the two of us, try to handle the Q&A and get that visible, but folks should feel free to toss in the host and panelist part of the chat, anything you want to get at, or just do it.
What is totally different is Rob and Brian have both got different backgrounds. That's radical.
I'm doing my work from anything.
I'm the usual, but
I'm the usual, and Nick, you're the usual.
Exactly right.
I'm in the office, Debbie. Yeah.
Maybe I could change things up a bit. Look. There you go.
Well, Debbie, half the time you're in the Berkshires these days. So
That's true. Not half, but yeah, probably half the time I talk to you. Yeah.
Exactly. I'm going to go ahead and start the webinar just so that people know that we're here, and we'll riff for a couple minutes more. Hey, folks, we are going to get started here in just a minute or two, but the usual background riff as we get the band together. And let folks come into this lovely, auspicious beginning. Hey, drop a hello and where are you from in the chat. I'm coming to you from a hotel room in Chicago, Illinois, Hyde Park, near the University of Chicago. I'm here to help my young adult son pack up an apartment so we can get to New York for the summer.
I'm here from Brookline, Massachusetts. Sorry, I was just going clockwise, Nick. But Brian, I spent 11 hours on Sunday driving from Boston to New York to move my daughter 4 blocks and then driving back.
Oh.
Nick, over to you.
I was actually going to say, Brian, what hotel are you in?
It's the Hyatt place. I mean, there's only like 3 or 4 here.
Yeah, exactly. I've been in there a few times because Hyde Park is now the great place to stay for the university. So I'm in another university town, Stanford.
I made the bed.
I recognize that layout.
Yeah, I made the bed so it doesn't look like I'm a complete, shambolic mess. Not that you would have seen it if I hadn't done that. So that's kind of. And then the weird part of all this, of course, is that Rob is in an office.
I know.
I am in the office. Well, office is 3 subway stops from home. And so it's 15 minutes door to door. And then I have 2 kids under 4. And so it is infinitely more productive for me to get away for 15-minute commute each way. But if it was 45 minutes or an hour, I think I'd feel very differently about that. So yes, I'm in the office.
I love these calls because it's only these calls where people feel like they have to apologize for being in the office. Always when you're doing a call, people apologize for being at home. Yeah, I'm flying out later this afternoon, so I just took these calls from home. So way to go, Rob.
I am trying to enable the chat. So we'll see if we get that going. Meanwhile, let's go ahead and just get ourselves started here. Michael, you mind putting up the welcome screen just so we can get going? There we go. And we're going to go through slides and do all this kind of stuff. Welcome, everybody. This is, we skipped 1 quarter of doing this, but we're back on track now. Rob and I will talk a little bit more about that towards the end of this conversation, but so glad to get everybody back here together and talk about the state of flexibility in the workplace and a lot more of related topics, AI, extreme employee centricity, radical employee centricity, sorry, Debbie, and more. So I'm going to kick us off, if you don't mind going to the next slide, Michael. So I'm Brian Elliott. I'm the CEO of Work Forward. Some of you know me from the Future Forum days as well, and I'm now the publisher of Flex Index. I didn't want to call myself CEO twice, Rob, so it just made sense to be the publisher of it. Flex Index tracks about 13,000 companies around the globe in terms of their workforce flexibility policies, 8,500 plus. They're US based. That's the basis for the Q2 report that I'll talk through. Let's go ahead and just start the slide flow and get into it. So we skipped a quarter. Probably should put a little extra time frame in this particular slide, but top line results are maybe surprising to people who only read the headlines, but probably not to those of you who follow this more closely. The majority of firms are still flexible. What's not happening is a 5-day-a-week return to office broadly, but we'll get into what is happening, which is more often 3 days a week. But still, 67% of firms out there have some sort of flexible work policy, which is pretty different if you dial your head back to 2019 and pre-pandemic days. Let's go to the next slide. The structured hybrid continues to be and gets even more dominant with pretty much every quarter that we look at it. Employee choice dropped a little bit in the Fortune 500 in particular. Structured hybrid grew. It actually grew more than full-time in office. Full-time in office was about 31% a year ago. It's 33% now. So there has been some growth back to that. It is primarily in the Fortune 500. Let's go to the next slide. And this is the specifics on like the changes that have happened over the course of the past year. So full-time in office went from 31% to 33%. Structured hybrid saw a much bigger gain, 38 going to 43. And it did that at the cost largely of fully flexible firms. And in particular, this is happening in bigger organizations, but most of the growth is happening in a structured hybrid format, not in a full-time in office format. Next slide shows the Fortune 500. This is where most of the change is occurring. We're seeing a lot less change at firms that are outside the Fortune 500. In particular, almost no change in firms that are 500 employees and below, who remain very flexible. And the shifts in the Fortune 500 still aren't exactly what you would call dramatic when you put it in the following context. The move from full-time office from 13% to 24% is sizable, but that compares to the 33% overall. And so what you're seeing in some of the bigger firms is a move back towards like the median of what a lot of other firms are doing. Some of that growth came at the expense of hybrid specific days. Hybrid specific days means I want you in the office Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, or in some cases, I want you in the office Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. Let's just add Monday onto it. There's still growth in the Fortune 500 in hybrid minimum number of days as well. And the place where it came out of was the full-out employee choice model in bigger firms is where you're seeing the decline be the greatest. Smaller companies, though, remain pretty flexible. So this is the comparison across size of all companies. So the 25K plus group is now 19% on average, full-time in office, 70% structured hybrid. It's clearly the dominant model in larger firms and organizations, versus go all the way to the other end of this, and you've got the fully flexible model in sub 500 employee population with a mix in between the two, with the sort of 5K and above looking a bit more like larger firms overall, and the firms that are 500 to 5,000 being a lot more mixed. This is probably the other significant change that we've seen over the course of the past couple of years, which is the shift towards more days in the office. If you trend line it out, which we'll show on the next page, you'll see, actually, let's go to the next page. This is the mix. This is one where we had fun with Nick's data as well as our own. The purple line is the number of days required according to policy. And what we've done is we've indexed that back to Q1 of 2024. So Q1 of 2024, the average number of days required by policy was 2.57. It's now 2.82. That's a 10% growth rate over that span of time. You'll see it actually dipped in Q2 of last year. But if you look at over that 5-quarter period, what you've got is 10% growth in number of days required according to policy for people to be in the office. If you look at Nick's Sway data, or if you look at the US Census data, which tracks exactly the same as Nick's, what you see is basically everything's barely moving in terms of what people are actually doing in terms of number of days in office. It goes up, it goes down. It happens that if you look at this last quarter, it's about 2% up. That's pretty close, by the way, to if you look at Placer AI data, or if you look at the Castle data, you see maybe a 2 to 3% shift over the course of the past year. So this is where we're getting into the divergence between policy and compliance. You can command it from the top. That doesn't mean that your managers in the middle are actually going to follow through, especially if they're going to have to follow through on employees who are performing just fine when the manager themselves is under pressure to produce. So with that, that's a good way to lead over to to Professor Bloom and have him talk through his data and where he's headed. Hi, Nick. And I'm going to try to figure out how to get the chat enabled.
Thanks very much, Brian. Yeah, the gap between compliance and what's actually happening is interesting and it's growing. The other stylized fact I heard is when companies have clampdowns, you see folks return to office for like 2-3 months and then they slowly slip back out again. So, when you measure it, you see a temporary burst. So I was actually going to talk about something horror, nothing to do with work from, or not so much to do with work from, which is AI. So next slide, thanks. So I was going to just have a few slides on what ecom research, like a very high level take on what ecom research thinks about the impact of AI, with the third bullet point, I guess, is work from home related. So why don't I go through kind of 3 stylized facts and I'll show you 2 or 3 papers that have looked at the data. So firstly is AI, unlike many other technologies over the last 50, maybe 100 years actually, appears to reduce the demand for higher skilled employees. So at Stanford, many of the undergrads and grad students are kind of panicking about the impact of AI on the labor market, and tech has become tight. I've heard, we've seen it over and over again in the news that tech firms are slowing hiring because of AI is replacing some particularly entry-level jobs. And I'll show you a paper from 2019 actually that kind of predicted this now 6 years ago. Second finding, in fact, builds on stuff that I've talked about with Brian a bunch, which is AI in the long run is going to be amazing for productivity, but there's what's called this J curve. The fact in the short run, it's actually can be negative. In the long run, it increases it. Why is that? It's because new technologies take other what's called complementary investments to work out. So changes in organizations, changes in training and product. And I'll talk about that. And then finally, I think AI is a friend of hybrid working from home. So that's going to build on what Brian has been talking about. I think it's maybe kind of a foe of fully remote. I think it's going to potentially push back on levels of fully remote. And it's possibly one factor behind what Brian was showing, that fully remote is declining and hybrid is rising. So next slide, thanks. So finding 1, I'm going to summarize in 3 slides, a paper by someone called Michael Webb. He was actually my PhD student at Stanford. He published his paper in 2019, but he did he did a bunch of the research in the kind of 2016, 17, 18, 19. What did he do? I'll show you his predictions are, and just come to pass. So what he did is he combined 2 different data sets. The first is he looked at around 7 million patents in the US. So he looked at every patent that's been taken out in the US Patent and Trademark Office since, in fact, over the last century. And in order to analyze patents, he'd break down patents into what's called verb-noun pairs. So he'd take, for example, all the patents in AI, or all the patents in robotics, or all the patents in software, or all the patents in electric engines, and break them down into verb-noun pairs. So take robotics, and patent verb-noun pairs may be lift box, maybe clean floor, maybe screw cap, for example, as a way to kind of synthesize patents. He then wanted to say, look, what do these patents, what do these technologies do in terms of the labor market? So to look at that, he went to occupations, and there's something called the Dictionary of Occupational Terminology, DOT, which is put out by the Department of Labor, that quite astoundingly lists the activities of about 15,000 occupations in the US. So as an example, one of them is macroeconomist. There's not just economist, but there's like 6 different flavors of economist. And what he did there again is to break occupations down into verb-noun pairs. So a macroeconomist may say forecast growth, predict inflation, analyze interest rates, for example. And so he's going to look at the impact of new technologies and occupations by looking at how overlapping these verb-noun pairs are between patents and the technologies they talk about and the occupations. So next slide, thanks. So here's an example. It's for an occupation called precision agriculture technicians. I don't know if everyone's heard of them, but they're kind of high end in agriculture. And on the left is the first 2 columns come from the Dictionary of Occupational Terminology, is what the Department of Labor thinks the precision agricultural technician does in the text and how much weight in their occupation it is. So if you look at the top left, it says use geospatial technology to develop soil sampling grids or identify sampling sites for testing characteristics such as nitrogen, phosphorus, or potassium content, pH, or micronutrients. I should pause at this point and say, Brian, I doubt you thought the word nitrogen, phosphorus, or potassium content was going to be in the flex.
Did not seem like the kind of thing we were going to bring up here, Nick. But congratulations, you may win a prize.
It's a first in terms of word bingo.
Most obscure thing added to this webinar.
Yeah, if anyone has, phosphorus in your word bingo, that you've done well. Anyway, so the Department of Labor gives that a 5% occupation weight, and you can see other activities going down. On the right is Mike Webb's stuff. So column 3, extracted pairs, is how he's summarized that activity into pairs. So develop grid, identify site, and test characteristic. And on the final column shows how exposed these activities are to AI based on about 50,000 AI patents. So you can see, for example, identify site is more likely to be an AI activity than test characteristic. As you go down, you can see things like determine implication have a very high AI score. So that's the kind of thing AIs like to do, or analyze data, whereas other things like maintain sensor is very low. So you can see how occupation by occupation, you can look at how exposed they are to AI or to other technologies. So next slide, thanks. So the big take from this is I'm just going to show you for 3 different technologies: robots, software, and AI. So top left, robots. Along the x-axis is occupations ranked by their wage percentile. So at the far left is low paid occupations. The very lowest paid, it's going to be like janitor, work, fast food server, fast food cleaner, and all the way up to the top at 100 is probably going to be investment banker, the very highest paid folks. And the y-axis is how exposed those occupations are to the verb-noun pairs in robotics patents. And there are hundreds of thousands of these patents. So it's a huge average of robotics. What you can see is low-paid occupations are very exposed. High-paid occupations really aren't exposed. Why is this relevant? Well, it explains why from the 1950s onwards, which has been the era of enormous growth of robotics in the US, 50s, 60s, 70s, including right up to the last decade, has been pretty devastating for folks at the bottom end of the wage distribution. So if you're in the lifting boxes profession, cleaning floors, screwing tops on type thing, robots have replaced your job. And that's been a huge driver of rising inequality. Top right, software. Software now does the kind of activities that middle paid jobs do. So if you can look behind me, there's this picture, and it's actually a bunch of clerks in a vast hall kind of shuffling pieces of paper around. And that's exactly the kind of thing that software is replacing. It's doing not typically non-manual, relatively repetitive tasks. And that's, hollowed out a lot of the middle part of the income distribution. And that has been happening over the last 30 years, and it's what's been called polarization. So finally down to AI. What's the prediction for AI? You can see at the bottom, AI, the types of activities that AI does, analysis, prediction, forecasting, actually looks a lot like the kind of things extremely high paid people do. So, where are we? Where are people listening? Most folks, for example, my grads at Stanford and other universities tend to end up in the top kind of 5-10%. You can see they're extremely exposed. So AI, I think, is radically different from the other types of technologies we've seen over the last 50 years. It's very focused on the top end of the labor market and actually not very focused on the bottom end of the labor market. And that is why, at least what I'm living in and seeing every day out in Stanford and Silicon Valley, is the labor market here is soft because AI is replacing the types of jobs that folks do, whereas robotics and software actually, if anything, was a complement. So that's fact 1. So let's go to the next slide. Thanks. So fact 2 is the J curve. I mean, this is something building on Brian pointed out, and here is spot on. So why don't I just explain the J curve and then explain how it relates to AI. So there's an old concept in economics, management, organizational decision-making called the J curve that highlights it can take a long time for a new technology to improve productivity because you need a lot of other changes going on. And the classic example people talk about is actually the electric motor. So when the electric motor came in, it replaced the steam engine. And for those of you that looked at old buildings or been in kind of New York loft style apartments, the steam engine was one massive motor with a big, rotational power that had a large, long pole, and everything came from belts off it. So if you look at factories built 100 years ago before the electric motor, they tended to be tall and thin. Loads of floors with belts coming off, basically manual transmission of power from one central steam engine. The electric motor is very different. It's lots of small electric motors which go in machine by machine. So when the electric motor first came in, people just replaced the steam engine with one electric motor, but leave the building as is, and it wouldn't generate masses of productivity improvements. Over time, folks realized, look, to use the electric motor, what we should really be doing is having one flat, massive, ugly looking building factory that has one level that's cheaper to build and hundreds of electric motors all over the place without the need of any pulleys or poles. But that took, decades to happen, which is why if you look at a factory built in 1990, it's a low slung, ugly shed. If you look at one built on, 1890, it's a tall building that's now typically converted into apartments. So this highlights the J curve. It's not just the electric motor that needed to change. You need to change building design, architecture, and hiring of technicians. How does it relate to AI? Well, on the right, there's a paper by Eric Brynjolfsson, who's actually my co-author, colleague here at Stanford, Dan Rock, Chad Syverson, and it points out that AI will have enormous effect on productivity, but it's going to take a long time. So it's not just, you can't just implement AI and expect everything to change. You have to change products and job specification, the strategy, and organizational structures, etc. I think the so what is, and economists endlessly bang on about this, that we're not going to see huge productivity improvements of AI in 25, 26, 27. We're likely to be seeing them in 2030, 2031, 2032, 2035. And that's true both at the aggregate level and individual company by company. So next slide, thanks. So finally, how does this relate to work from home? So paper on the left came out in the Quarterly Journal of Economics. It's the oldest journal in economics. It was founded about 150 years ago. It's Harvard MIT's journal. And it was a very nice piece, again, by Eric Brynjolfsson, Danielle Lee, and Lindsay Raymond, that looks at call centers. And actually, I spoke to Lindsay quite a bit about this paper. The basic idea is in call centers, increasingly, when you phone up, AI is listening to what you are saying and recommending to the person taking the call a response. So if I'm in a call center and Debbie phones me, the AI is listening to everything Debbie is saying. I have a headset on, there's a screen in front of me, and it's giving me suggested responses to Debbie. Increasingly, it's not even bothering to suggest it to the human, it's just responding directly. This highlights, as AI gets better and better, it's going to replace fully remote tasks, particularly low-skilled tasks, things like call centers, data entry, basic HR. As time goes on, I think AI is going to increasingly get more sophisticated and replace more and more fully remote roles, kind of moving up the skill threshold. So I think in the medium to long run, we're looking 3-5 years out. AI is quite a threat to fully remote jobs. On the right is another topic that's come up a bunch from talking to execs. This is, I'd say, less research and more just anecdote. I've heard this from 4 or 5 folks, which is there's a rising concern over authenticity. So I put an example here of the White House chief of staff. There was an attempt to impersonate her using AI. And apparently this is becoming increasingly common. And what does it mean? A number of execs have said because of this concern, they are increasingly comfortable with folks being in even just 1-2 days a week, even if it doesn't make them more productive. It makes it easier to authenticate the person you're speaking to as the individual. And if you've got to do something sensitive, you're just going to do it when they're in person to make sure they're not being impersonated. With that, I'll pass on to, I'm sure, the real Debbie Lovich. Thanks.
Absolutely real, although that picture was taken 13 years ago, so maybe I'm clutching to youth there, but it's the same one. So so thank you for the setup and talking about generative AI. And if I just link it to the data, around flex work and, what it means for workers. And Nick, a lot of the workers you point to, right, are employees that may be out of a job as a result of Gen AI. And, where I want to take this is, talking a little bit about the adoption challenge that organizations have around Gen AI. And Nick, I love your slides. Hopefully I could borrow them. The point that, every company is pushing Gen AI right now for productivity and saying, we're going to drive this for productivity and we're going to expect to see an ROI about it. And what does that do to employees that are meant to incorporate it into their workflows? Well, it gets them to go like this, like, don't give it to me, because I don't want to put myself out of a job. Or even if I'm on a different point in your chart of replacement, Nick, I don't want to learn new skills. Human beings love mastery. Or I know at the end of the day, this Gen AI thing is all about getting me to do more work with less resource. So you're going to double, triple, quadruple, 10 upple, whatever, my productivity requirements with this. And so I think organizations are at this, fork in the road about pushing Gen AI for productivity and getting quite understandable resistance to it from employees. And Brian and Rob, to link to your data on flexible work, what does pushing for days in office do? It gets employees also to push back. And they're all messages that we don't trust our employees to deliver. We need to look at them. We want to replace them. We want to give them more to do. And so maybe I'll take a step back, and if we could flip ahead 2 slides, I'll skip the first one. I think the way the world is receiving flexible work and receiving Gen AI is really in what I call the transaction trap. It's this us versus them dynamic between, employer and employee, the downtrodden employee that's trying to push back, the untrusted employee that's trying to say, wait a minute, I delivered for you 5 years ago in COVID and you weren't measuring my badge swipes, right? And the organization that's trying to drive more efficiency and more effectiveness. And, Brian mentioned earlier, radical employee centricity, because that is the lever I think every organization needs to pull to move from the left to the right, from this transactional animosity, trying to squeeze more out of employees, we don't trust you, we don't have your back, to the right, which is work that works for everyone. And if you don't make that switch, if you don't become radically employee-centric, and I've shared in past one of these, if any of you have been on, about the importance of employees enjoying work. And we know, I won't reshare the data here, don't worry, but we know that employees who enjoy work are 50 to 60% less likely to be looking for a job. And even in today's constrained work environment, we also know they're 2 to 4x more likely to come to work more motivated every day. So constrained job environment, right? So even if you're not worried about losing your best people, which you should be worried about people coming to work every day, bringing their all. And so back to the Gen AI problem, which is we have this, stuff with a productivity promise, but by saying productivity, it's dead on arrival. How do you get there? And I'll just share a couple of slides from my research about how you can use the implementation of Gen AI to actually help you go from a transaction trap to work that works for everyone. And we have found through our research, I'm part of BCG's Henderson Institute, the group that's, our think tank looking around the corner. So in our research, we found 3 things that you need to drive Gen AI adoption, to speed your way along the J curve that Nick just showed to us. One is you need managers. It all comes back to the manager. Managers who are excited about the technology, who explain the why, they are supportive, and they also, most importantly, use it themselves. And so if we just flip ahead to 1 slide, just some data on that, where you could see, top teams in a piece of research we did and published about last summer, top teams use generative AI 3 times. Those are the bottom teams. And when we looked at the managers on those teams, what did the ones on the right, the top 10% of the team usage, do differently than those on the bottom? They scored higher when you ask the employees, does my manager care about me? They scored higher. They help employees see the value, they explain the why, and they use the tools themselves, right? So those are the characteristics. And then just back a slide to other things you need to do to drive use Gen AI as a way to become more employee-centric is the middle. You need to make sure employees are at the center of using Gen AI. And when you roll it out, you're not rolling it out for productivity, but you're rolling it out in a way to make work better for employees. And so if you flip ahead 2 more slides, I'll just give you a picture here. And so this is work, and I think I've shared this before, before on these calls, but if we ask employees about how they spend their week, this is just the sample data from, I think, 1,500 different employees, or 1,000 different employees on the left, knowledge workers or office workers, I prefer to call them, about where they spend their week. And we asked them to allocate the amount of time to each type of work. And then we asked them if they enjoyed that work. And you could see if you don't even talk about productivity at all, and you just deploy generative AI tools to get rid of the red stuff, the toil in their day-to-day work, the day and a half a week that employees spend in soul-sucking admin work, if you just use Gen AI to get rid of that, the productivity will happen. You will get it, save their time. But you also see they have a lot of what Brian and I call meh work, the gray stuff there. You could also use Gen AI to take away the little micro parts of the work, like collecting the data or cleaning the data, or aligning the data sets to even make the meh work more enjoyable. And so my argument is, that middle box of the page before, that if you really want to move from transaction to work that works, you really need to be employee centric in what you do. This is an example. And the best way to do it is with employees, how you do it. And then the last one, I won't make you flip back, Michael. Okay, you did. The last one is just making time and space and resources to upskill teams. And so with one client we were working, we did the employee-centric thing, and we asked people, engineers, how many of you want to use Gen AI? 80% said yes. Okay, so we rolled it out. Or several weeks later, months later, only 25% of those who wanted to use it had logged in even once. And that's the giving people the time and space to learn these tools. And so what we did with this client is we simply erased their backlog for a month. We said the only thing you have to do, the only thing you're going to be measured on is using these tools well. And so I won't drain this slide because I'm probably out of time, but these are the things we see and distill from our research to how to not only roll out Gen AI, if that's the only thing you care about, right? The manager's excited, putting employees at the center and making time and space. I'll let you read the little bullets there. But it's also a way to use the Gen AI really transformation tsunami to move from a transaction trap, this us versus them dynamic characterized by you must be in the office, to work that works for everyone, and where you're really being employee centric and solving for how do we take away the terrible parts of your day and use technology for that, and focus on the more enjoyable parts. And the good or bad news, I'm an optimist, so maybe I'll say the good news on the next page is, if you look at what companies are doing, they're not doing this very well. So that's the good news, because there's lots of opportunity for organizations to differentiate themselves and do some of the things that we had on the prior page, rather than what's actually happening today, where it's just like, here's the tool, use it, here's some, standardized training, and not really giving them, here's how to take away the tough parts of your job, and not co-creating them with them and things like that. All right. Enough on joy and toil, and back to you, Brian and Rob.
Thank you, Debbie. So Rob and I are going to have a brief chat, then we're going to get to the Q&A because there's a lot of it and it's great. Rob, you started this thing up, this Flex Index. Give us a little bit of the origin story as part of and what you learned as you went along.
Sure. It's a combination of, as most things are, a little bit of head and a little bit of heart, if you will. And if I think back to where we were, and this was into 2021, early 2022, we were tinkering with software that we thought was interesting related to kind of the evolution of work. And one of the kind of the thesis points that my brother, who's my co-founder, and our team had was, hey, maybe coordination is going to be really hard. It'd be hard to figure out who's going to be in the office and when, and do we want to actually invest in trying to solve that, create better visibility. So we started to tinker and build some software. And very quickly we realized, okay, well, we need test customers, companies, to kind of start to play with this stuff. And we reach out to a company and say, hey, would this be useful to you? And they'd be like, actually, we're full-time in office. Somebody else would be like, actually, no, we gave up our office. We're fully remote, or hybrid. And we started to realize, hey, we can't segment. We don't know who to go talk to. There's no good way to understand who's doing what to be able to support them with software. So we started to look for data. we said, okay, well, somebody must have collected this data. Like, we're not the only company in the world that cares about whether BCG is full-time in office, or fully remote, or hybrid. And we started to find that, hey, not only had no one put it together, but actually there was like a lot of false information out there on what was happening broadly. And so it kind of created this interesting new space where we said, hey, what if we go spend a bunch of energy and start to collect this data? What would that enable us to do in terms of not just our own purposes, but creating visibility and better understanding how the market was evolving? And that was the seed, Brian, in some ways, that kind of like led to what ultimately became the Flex Index. At the same time, for me personally, I was experiencing, my daughter was born, I have 2 kids, and my daughter, who's my oldest, was born in August 2021. And going through that experience and watching my wife go on, she did, I think, 4 months, maybe 5 months of kind of parental leave beginning, and seeing how important it was to her when she was pregnant to be able to not be in the office every day and then step away, and then what it meant to transition back into work and not have to be in the office every day, and then want to be in the office more. And then our second was born. And so just watching how this evolved for a single person and have that kind of like front row seat to it, and how important it is to have some of that flexibility was deeply important to me personally. And you start to look at some of the data around how people that were aged 25 to 54 were participating in the workforce. I think women in particular, all-time highs. And you start to understand the importance of what it means for large segments of the population to not necessarily have to be in every day. So it's a combination of both kind of like pulling a thread, if you will, and found something that we found was really interesting, and just personally believing this topic is really important and wasn't being reported in a way that was reflective of what actually was happening in the marketplace.
It's been a really important resource. And that's kind of where I came in with you all also, because Future Forum was tracking employee preferences. What do people want? And the ability to bounce back and forth between those two data sets was really important, right? What do people want versus what policies are being put in place? Nick tracks it where he gets data from a lot of people on an ongoing longitudinal basis, but the Flex Index was like a lovely, and continues to be, a nice neutral source of insight and data. Can't help but notice, Rob, you actually are sitting in an office today, though, for the first time. Every other time we've done this, you've been at home with the shoji screen behind you. What's up?
It's funny. It's kind of reflective of the same things, Brian, that we were just talking about, right? Like I joined a company to run operations and strategy, a company called Headway. And I don't know if folks are familiar with Headway, but we match therapists with patients and help therapists take insurance. The mission of the company is to build a better mental health care system that everyone can access. And scale of the business is pretty meaningful. We have a large office in New York and a couple other places across the US. And just like for me, for a long period of time, working from home was actually great, like really productive. Now I have 2 kids under 4 at home, who are sometimes in school, but most of the time not in school. The office is 15 minutes away from me. It's 3 subway stops. I live in New York, and it's really productive to come into the office. It's actually easier for me to come in and spend that time and then go back home. And so even for me, like, it changes year to year based on what I'm doing. And that's been an important shift. One of the things in terms, we talk about this a lot, as you might imagine, in terms of like, what's our policy and how do we think about this for our employees? And we've set it up so that it's employees' choice. Like, we have no required office time. We make certain investments on certain days of the week, like Tuesdays and Thursdays at lunch, that's covered by the company in the office. We would love for people to come in more often, but we hired 2/3 of the company remotely during COVID, and so like it's an incredibly difficult shift to take. It's a really interesting front row seat to something we've talked about in past webinars, which is I can totally see how when companies struggle, and you see this with public companies, the desire to have people to come in would increase, right? Like all of a sudden you're like, oh, I need to find more control over what's happening. Let me pull people back in. You can totally see it as an executive, like in terms of like what it feels like to do that. Companies doing well, we feel no pressure at all to do that in practice. I think people do great work. There's no difference actually, practically, in terms of people working in the office versus not. But it is nice to be able to spend time and see people face to face and have some balance in that regard.
Yeah, there's no right answers here at the end of the day on this. There's some answers that are a little bit worse, but there's not like one specific answer that's going to be right for any organization or any team, to be honest. So that's part of the ongoing struggle. That's great.
Brian, curious to hear, as we do this transition, you're kind of like move into the seat, if you will. Like, what are some of the things that are most top of mind for you for Flex Index, if you're open to talking about that before we get into Q&A more broadly?
I was going to say, besides figuring out how to enable chat in a webinar, yeah, there are a few things along the way. that we're figuring out. For me, part of this was really do think that this is a valuable source of data and insight. And so working with you, with John, with Adam, with Michael, with Kate, with Ash, to get it, back up to speed and in fighting shape, for lack of a better term around it, was an important first step. So we want to continue to provide the Flex Index as an important source to people as we go out. I'm also excited, we've already started some conversations with partners about ways in which we could explore enhancing the data and getting insights out of it. Debbie, there was some fantastic work that you and I have been talking about already that you and Rob and team did a couple of years ago, comparing policy with financial performance of organizations, the Glassdoor data comparisons that were really interesting and insightful. The markets have moved and times have changed. It'd be really interesting to pick up on some of those threads again, as well as others. And then there's other conversations about, I get in the middle of this all the time where you have workplace professionals who often feel stuck, not because they don't want to do the right thing, but because they have senior executives who continue to think that there's going to be a snap back to 2019 that's going to happen, when the evidence has yet to actually show that that's where we're going to head. And that tends to freeze workplace people in place. And it means that the workplaces themselves haven't evolved, which we know has a negative impact as well on people's willingness to come in. Because if you're coming back into a space that looks exactly like 2019, but now you've 5x'd your number of Zoom calls per day, it's not going to work for you. The other major shift that's huge is, there's the majority of most teams are now distributed across geographies. That wasn't true pre-pandemic. And that's one of the biggest pinch points in all of this. If you're being asked to come in 3, 4, 5 days a week in order to be together with your team, but your team is spread out across not just buildings, but cities and time zones, it just feels false. And honestly, a lot of managers are pretty resistant. So how do we start putting data behind this that gets at what's the benefit and correlation between policy and redesign, and what's the right way to lay out spaces, and how can we build things that are more effective from a human-centered perspective? And to sort of land on where Debbie was going, and Nick to a large degree also, there's a reset in the employee-employer relationship that needs to happen. I was having a conversation with a couple of academics earlier today about the contract that's been broken over the past few years in both directions around, how do you drive incentive for people to perform? It's usually not with sticks. It's usually with carrots that it's more effective. And what will be interesting to watch is the sort of continued evolution. Do we continue to see a move towards, one size fits all magical thinking? Or do we see people continue to evolve? And I see Debbie went off mute on that one. So have at it.
I can't help myself.
Do it.
But, and it's also, it's not just carrots and sticks. It's changing that whole metaphor. It's empowering employees to make the work what they need. It's not like, what do we need to do for our entitled employees? It's, what you're accountable for. What do you need to make work, enable you to be your best and feel great about it and enjoy it, and change that dynamic, that transactional us versus them, into we're all in it together. And so much of the dialogue just perpetuates this us versus them.
I'll drop a link to it. I wrote a piece today based off of some data that Lenny's newsletter came up with, polling 8,000 tech workers in terms of their level of burnout, which, it's partly the rise of pressure from generative AI. But if you look at the data, there's some relationship to flexibility people get, but most of it comes back to, does my manager suck? Or is my manager good? And what's my relationship like there? Let's get into the questions. The first one that came up was essentially, in terms of the move to full-time in office, it's interesting being on the side of interviewing at organizations. Recruiters often tell me that they are moving in the future to 4 days in office, if not 5. Hiring managers are telling me they're kind of tired of people not coming into the office. Anybody want to tackle that one first?
I mean, I'll make a comment. This is this amazing disconnect that I keep hearing this, and you read it in the media, and I do hear this from individuals, and I've talked to a few tech firms around here, 2 or 3 of them publicly listed, that are considering moving to more days in office, although we just don't see it in the data. that's what kind of, and it's not just one data set. Just to be clear, there are 3 different data sets, completely different. There's our survey stuff, there's Placer AI tracking cell phones, and there's the swipe data from Castle. And they all have strengths and weaknesses, but they all show the same thing. It's kind of flat. There's a slight upward trend. So I don't honestly understand it. I tend to trust the data because it's of hundreds of thousands of observations. But
I was just gonna say, does your stuff also control with all the word I learned in the past couple of years, LARPing, where people send their badge in with someone else to badge in, or just go in, badge in, get a cup of coffee, come back? Like, again, in that non-trusting relationship, there's a lot of fudging the data too that employees are doing.
Yeah, I mean, yes, although the Placer AI stuff tracks cell phones, and people don't tend to send. So one explanation is big firms, larger firms are getting people back, but new startups and smaller firms tend to be more remote. And there's a continual process of creative destruction in the economy. Large firms, they tend to slowly have a smaller share as new firms come. It's a complicated story to explain, but we just don't see it in the aggregate data. I mean, you just do not see that people are returning to the office, as Brian showed in the Flex Index. So I'm a bit, there's compliance, but compliance has been tightening up as well. I mean, that's the other thing I hear. So I don't know. I just think large firms aren't totally representative. I think big firms maybe are forcing people back, but a lot of smaller firms are not.
There's also just a gap in compliance inside those firms. So Nick Halverson, who runs OccuSpace, they track 50 million square feet. So because they look at companies that have a variety of policies and compliance, his take was, even at the firms that are 5 days a week policy and are saying we'll fire you if you don't come in, are not getting anywhere near that. They might be getting 3 days a week. That shouldn't be surprising to some degree, because that's sort of what you got pre-pandemic also, partly because you have sick days and people visiting customers, but also because managers cut a side deal. And the reality underneath this at the end of the day is the senior leadership might want people coming in more often, but the people who are on the front line who are under dramatic pressure these days to drive AI adoption and to drive productivity gains aren't going to fire somebody who's a good performer just because they don't show up. It's not going to happen. I'm going to keep us going. Gilbert asks a question that I wish we had Ryan Anderson on the call for, but we'll take our best shot at it. How are you leveraging technology, environmental sensors, and tunable spaces to create smarter, more adaptive office experiences to take into account different worker chronotypes? I'm not personally sure of what a lark versus an owl are, but I do know what neurodivergent workers are, as employees return to increasingly structured in-office schedules.
I think people aren't doing it nearly enough. It's not happening.
Yeah.
I think people are getting that your office space needs to be attractive and productive, but I don't think they've gotten to the level of employee segmentation. My daughter works, she used to be remote, now she has to be in 3 days a week. She suffers from a concussion. She actually physically can't work. There's no accommodation, right? Like, it's, I don't think it's there yet, unfortunately.
I agree. Yeah, and if Ryan were here, one of the things he'd say is a lot of those different types, similar spaces in an office, quiet spaces where you can close a door, can help a large range of people. Unfortunately, a lot of employers are just going with the simple, like, let's shrink the space that we've got and let's crank up the policy. And that's what causes some of the resistance as well. This isn't just like, I don't want to do it. This is, the space doesn't fit my needs and I'm actually less productive coming into it. Nick, you guys actually put out a study all of last week or so. There's an NBER thing that you guys did on call center workers and productivity and training. You want to chat a bit about what you guys found?
Yeah, I mean, there were 3 starlights. So we looked at a large call center that was fully in person up until the pandemic, and then was forced to go fully remote at the beginning of the pandemic, and just discovered it was a lot better and has stuck with it. So they're in the process now of selling all their office space. We studied it. We have thousands of people in this call center. So there, to be clear, these are people taking calls. They sit with their headsets on. The 3 starlight facts is: 1, their productivity was about 10% higher remote. Why is that? Because call centers are low wage, and by nature, when you put them in an office, they're very cramped and it's very noisy. And they just said it's damn hard to hear anything in the office. When you're at home, it's quieter. So they're actually, it's phenomenally profitable sending them home, because you're A, saving an office space, and B, they're 10% more productive. Fact 2 is really interesting as well, in that they saw a big increase in hiring of women, particularly married women, folks in rural areas, and that enabled them to increase the education and the experience level of their employees without spending any more money. So basically, the share of employees with a graduate with 5+ years of experience went up by about a half on the same wage structure. And what's going on is they're saying there are these amazing employees that are not going to commute into, the center of a city, but will work fully remotely. And then thirdly, what's interesting, I've heard a lot about fully remote workers, is they had folks start off ideally for 3 months in person and migrate them out. They said there was some initial benefit of having in-person mentoring for the first 2-3 months. But yeah, that's an industry, by the way, call centers, data entries, a bunch of industries that are just clearly better, fully remote or almost fully remote.
I think
And we
there's
saw that
also
as well.
go
Sorry.
ahead, Debbie.
Yeah, we saw that as well with call centers and just some of our client work. And I'd say there were a couple other benefits, just like psychologically, people felt like more autonomy, like they didn't have to ask permission to go to the bathroom kind of setting. And also they felt like their wages went up because they didn't have to buy work clothes and commuting costs. And so just overall they felt better with those benefits as well.
I think the one other piece that's worth thinking about relative to like a call center or someone, a sales development representative, for example, relative to some other roles, is these roles are highly measurable, highly outcome oriented. And so as a result, managing them is very different. The data is clear, you know how many calls take place, you know the solves per hour, you know the resolution time. And so it's a lot easier to have the conversation like, do I really care if this is remote or not? Well, I actually care about the metric, like what are we actually seeing in performance around it? In other types of work where the outcomes are less clear, the manager has to work harder to communicate and align on clarity of outcome and whether someone's doing a good job. I think that's where like hiring manager exhaustion comes in, where it's like, hey, you have to be better as a manager to like handle what it means for folks to be remote in things where it's a little bit more opaque from a performance perspective. And I think that's part of like what lies beneath the surface in some of the policy changes.
Yeah. It was interesting in the Lenny's newsletter piece, which I dropped a link to. One of the findings that they actually had was that, at least in tech, remote leadership was actually slightly more effective than the hybrid or fully in person, which is going to blow the minds of a lot of leaders who think that it's impossible or challenging. I think that's in part because people have had to learn skills, and you've been under so much pressure, you have to get better at it. Also partly because they found that there's about twice as many managers who were bad overall as good. So your odds are not fantastic. We can't leave without talking about AI and the impact on jobs. Let's actually tackle that a little bit in terms of early career roles and entry-level roles. Won't AI simply help individuals in those roles do higher level work? What role does education play in helping people learn the business and their function to level up? Basically, if you read all the variety of news pieces that are coming out over the past couple of weeks, there's a pretty major fear right now that it's AI taking away entry-level jobs. Would love to have, Debbie, Nick, Rob, you all opine on that one.
Well, maybe I'll link it to a question I answered, in the chat about, cybersecurity and risk and compliance, like as we go to these technologies. That's a whole new class of jobs that needs to expand greatly. I think with any technology revolution, jobs are eliminated, telephone book people, and jobs are created. And I do think you'll see the same here. It puts a burden on communities and governments to reskill employees going into some of these new job classes. But because go back to the call center example. If Gen AI could answer 90% of the calls, on its own, those call center jobs are going to go away. But there are other classes of jobs that are going to open, right? And you still need, by the way, people to handle the tough calls, and those people for job satisfaction need to get some easy calls too, or else it's a miserable job. And so you're not going to get the 90%, but you're also going to need people who can do the quality control and the monitoring on what Gen AI is doing, because we all know it gets it wrong, and it will get it wrong a lot. And so there's definitely a shifting. So maybe that's a long way of saying, I do think it will level up in those same job categories. Like you need the best people to handle the tough calls, and you need your best people to check the quality of the generative AI. But overall, the numbers in that job category will go down, but there will be other job categories that will open up, which is really a policy and government question as well as an employer question, how you reskill people for those.
Fantastic. Rob, you're actually in a firm that uses and leverages AI.
Yeah, I don't think from what I'm seeing, I think about this both within Headway, but also more broadly. Look, having entry-level people is really important. Any growth company that wants to exist in perpetuity recognizes that leadership will evolve and people will not be there forever. And you have to be able to train next generations of what it means to be able to lead and move the company forward, whether it's a technology company or any industry. What I think is happening in reality is I think in tech, at least, and just hiring is just less hiring. Like it's become a badge of honor within startups to be like, we got to X million in revenue and we have 12 people, 3 engineers, whatever it is. Like, and that's a very different world than what used to be a badge of honor. It's like our company is tripling headcount every year, like 10 years ago in like the ZERP era, if you will, like very different type of dynamic that was playing out in practice. And so do I think that means that like we're going to not hire entry level folks? No, of course we're going to hire entry level folks. I just think it means that the job might look quite different to be entry level over time, relative and kind of like much more shaped by different tooling and technology. We may not hire as many entry level folks, but candidly, we probably won't hire as many folks at any level, on a go forward basis than maybe where we were prior.
Go, Nick.
I was going to say, I'll give you an anecdote on this, which is I was in Google about 4 months ago, and they have a beautiful, massive campus down in Sunnyvale. And I was in one of their new buildings being shown around. It was beautiful. It's like, 5-6 stories with a great canteen. And as we were walking up the stairs, you could look out the window and there was a vegetable patch with folks growing like cucumbers, tomatoes, I should say, lettuces, etc. And I said to my host, what's that? And she said, well, Google bought this building next door that someone else owned, and they ripped it down, and they were going to build another beautiful building as one of, building 25 or whatever in their campus. But they decided, and Sundar Pichai said that headcount forecasts are no longer upward sloping. They're now going to go sideways. As Rob and Debbie were saying, it's chilled hiring in tech. And so they thought, well, we don't need this building. So while we're figuring out what to do with the space, we'll just turn it into a vegetable garden. And apparently Google employees, if they want to, can go out and then till the earth, there's a break for now. And that stuff is served in the canteen. But, it was a clear top-down decision at one of tech's biggest firms that rather than job growth going like that, it's now going to go sideways, and it's affected real estate, and no doubt affect many other things. But that was, for me, a hundreds of millions of dollars investment decision that was clearly predicated entirely and explicitly on that.
There's a big difference between the big tech firms that I'm seeing and the mid and small tech. The big tech firms are the ones that are also spending tremendous amounts of money on generative AI infrastructure and tooling, which means that their profitability is going to go down unless their efficiency goes up. They also are trying to prove that these tools can drive efficiency, and they're therefore out to drive it one way or another, which means holding headcount steady and increasing the demands on people on a year-on-year basis and saying, figure it out. That may or may not work out for them in some ways. And also leaves that kind of gap of, who's next. It was interesting. The guy who runs DeepMind was interviewed and said, no, our engineering hiring plan is exactly the same as what it was before. So he was kind of in some ways countering, their own message, which means it's being squeezed out of every place else in Google, in Amazon, in Microsoft, and all the other sort of big tech players. What I'm seeing more broadly is, to Rob's point, there's sort of a long-term set of growth needs. And Fran Seal made a point in one of the questions about, this is a J curve that's probably faster than a lot of others, but it's faster if you actually make the investments Debbie was laying out. If you actually have managers spend time with their teams working out that this is okay, talking through norms, doing experimentation, having a little bit of fun with it, and focusing on what takes the toil out of it. I think that just putting pressure on people at some point might lead to something breaking in some of those firms. So we will try to answer others of these offline, but at that, we're at the hour, and I wanted to really thank my fellow panelists for being here for another one of these awesome events.
Thanks for having us. Always
Thank
fun.
you.
Thanks, everybody, for joining us.